Hello, everybody. Thank you. I would like to start, please. As you can see, we're running a little bit late, but welcome back after lunch to this second session, presentations and panel debate on the evidence findings and review recommendations of the WHO Europe report. I'd like to very quickly introduce, slightly steering away from our programme, Alan Dyson is going to speak first. He's Professor of Education at the University of Manchester, where he co-directs the Centre for Equity in Education, and he leads the work on education in urban context. And for the review, he co-chaired the task group on early years. And so, Alan, please do give us your opening comments on early years development. Alan Dyson, to the lectern, please. Thank you.
Well, apologies for hijacking the agenda like this. I have to catch a train from Euston very shortly. However, what I've got to say is fairly brief. I want to report on the work that a group of us did in the Early Years Family and Education Task Group. I guess we can take it as read that early years and childhood generally are of crucial importance for the agenda that we're discussing today, not simply because of the immediate impacts on health outcomes in the early years and childhood years, but because it's childhood in general, and I think we would say early years in particular, that develop the capacities that people go on and have and the dispositions that they go on and have that then impact on their behaviours and the choices they make, but that also open up or close down the life chances that young people go on and have, which themselves have an impact on health outcomes. That said, there were a group of us who tried to use such expertise as we had, and we come from diverse backgrounds, to try to make sense of what was a very wide field. But we did two other things besides drawing on our own knowledge and our own work in research in this field. One was that we're not the first group to have looked at childhood inequalities or even at childhood inequalities in relation to health inequalities. So we tried to establish the state of the art by looking at reports from a whole series of other transnational organisations that had looked in this field. But perhaps even more important, given the task that we had, we opted not simply to stick with the research, but to invite experts from a range of countries across the European region to submit case studies of work that was going on in their countries that they thought was addressing childhood inequalities and directly or indirectly addressing health inequalities. And that was important because it seemed to us that context matters in terms of what can be done, and that what can be done in different countries may share a common set of principles, but will actually need to be structured and organised in different ways. Therefore, it was important to provide a range of practical examples of what could be done. And I think also something that is worth stressing is that our report, like all the other task group reports, talks to the European region as a whole. And there is a problem that most of the high-quality evidence and most of the examples tend to come from the north and west of that region. So we were deliberately trying to search examples from elsewhere. And our task group report and a set of country case studies will be published very shortly on the WHO Europe website, and all I can do now is talk about some general principles. I do urge you, if you're interested in this field, to try and look at those reports as they become available over the next few days, next few weeks. Very briefly then, some key principles in terms of what we found. In a sense, these principles are obvious, but just because they're obvious doesn't mean to say that they are followed everywhere, or indeed that they're followed perfectly anywhere. If you wish to make a difference to childhood inequalities and thereby to have an impact on health inequalities, political will and leadership are crucial. At national level, also at local level, but particularly, I think, at national level. And the fact is that there are, just as there are differences in health inequalities across the European region, so if you look at childhood inequalities, what we find is that different countries tolerate different levels of inequality. And that is not related to the overall wealth of the country. It's related to political decisions. So there is no way out of the obligation on policymakers to be committed to tackling inequality. The positive side of that is, as we found in a whole range of examples, there are many governments that are exercising some degree of leadership in this field. And we had an example this morning from Wales of the kinds of things that are routinely going on. The second principle is that we need a multi-strand, multi-level approach. There is no magic bullet in this field. And although the temptation is to go for single-strand initiatives that look highly promising, the reality is that the relationship between children's backgrounds and the outcomes they get in health and in a whole range of other fields is an extremely complex one. And therefore, it seems likely that it's only through multi-strand, complex initiatives sustained over time that any real difference is going to be made. And that's a problem for policymakers who clearly, for good reasons, want to do things that are relatively manageable and can be done relatively straightforwardly. But again, an example of the kind of multi-strand approach we came across again and again in our examples was the Malmö case that Denny talked about this morning, where you have a whole range of things being done simultaneously. That then relates to, again, something that in some countries is very familiar but is worth restating. We know that childhood services tend to be provided in silos. And we know that if you really want to make a difference, one of the things that you have to do is to work towards integration of different services and integration of different policy areas. And that's the horizontal integration that we're talking about, so that you can get the kind of complex, coordinated approaches we're talking about. But equally important is vertical integration, in the sense that initiatives that come from the top down, that are top-down policies, have to be met by initiatives that grow from the bottom upwards, that are grassroots initiatives. And managing the balance between those, and then crucially, managing the integration between what's said at national policy level and what actually happens on the ground, is an extremely complex task. But again, in our report, and particularly in the country case studies, we provide examples of how and where that's been done in a range of countries. The fourth principle, again, is obvious in a sense and yet difficult to implement. And that is that much of the work that really makes a difference actually doesn't come from policy and doesn't come from initiatives. It comes from the detailed face-to-face interactions of the childhood workforce of various kinds with children and their families. And it seems that there is no substitute for valuing that workforce, training that workforce, professionalizing the workforce, and rewarding that workforce appropriately. And that would appear to be a very powerful intervention and a very good investment. A further principle that's important, and again, it takes different forms in different countries, is the importance of data. Data for identifying what the problem is, data for identifying vulnerable groups, data for targeting interventions and policies accurately, and crucially, data for feedback on what seems to be working effectively and what isn't working effectively. Some countries have got very good at generating rich data on their childhood populations in recent years. But I think our finding was that that is really rather uncommon. And the availability of data across the European region is extremely patchy. And that means that many initiatives and many interventions are being based on what seemed to be like good ideas at the time, rather than on a careful monitoring of what is actually happening out there and the impact that interventions have. So we think it's really important that countries and local administrations should be thinking carefully about how they can begin to set up data generation systems, how they can then analyze the data they've got, and how they can use it productively to inform the work they're doing in this area. And then the final principle that we think is important, and in a sense, I suppose, as a group of researchers, we would say this, wouldn't we? But let me give it a particular spin, is that we simply don't know enough. And this is not simply about monitoring data. This is that the evidence that we have in the European region as to what works, where it works, for whom it works, and why, is simply inadequate. So, as I said at the beginning, we're getting very rich data and very rich examples from some part of the region, but there is much less data and there are far fewer examples from other parts of the region, and therefore we don't quite know what's working there. And that's one dimension of what we don't know. Another one is that the quality of evaluation across the childhood years, particularly when we're looking at complex interventions and wide-ranging interventions, is not good. That's something to do with the technical difficulties of evaluation, but it's also to do with a culture in which evaluation is either not itself valued, or we're looking for evaluations to be short-term and underpowered and give quick answers, and that simply isn't the case. And then the final thing in terms of evidence is that we have evidence from some kinds of interventions, but not others. So we have good evidence, good research evidence in the early years, by and large. We have good evidence on interventions for older children when those interventions are based in schools, but we know very little indeed about the kinds of interventions that might be done for older children in community settings and outside schools. And that goes for countries that are data rich and that are well resourced, as well as for economically poorer countries. So if I wanted to sum all of this up, I'd say the early years matter, childhood matters. What needs to be done is actually technically very simple. There will be nothing I've said that will come as a huge surprise, I guess, to the people who are gathered here. It's technically simple, but it's politically and organizationally complex. So we know what to do. The real issue is keeping the pressure on to do the right things. Thank you, and please excuse me that I have to leave.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan Dyson, and I hope you get back to Manchester safely. So we slightly did do things a little bit backwards because Alan had to leave because we started late. It's not his fault. So Michael Marmot, perhaps you can now go back and introduce for us briefly the themes of the review. Thank you.
So my task is to set the context for what Alan was going to say, but you can cope, it's after lunch. And to talk about the themes, as I said in introducing the challenges this morning, the European Review of Social Determinants of Health and the Health Divide very much continues in the tradition of the WHO Global Commission on Social Determinants of Health, where we talked about social justice, and indeed of the English review, which we called fair society, healthy lives. A statement that if you put fairness at the heart of all policy making, health would improve and health inequalities would diminish. So the theme of social justice, the theme of empowerment, runs right through the European review. As we discussed briefly before lunch, Zainab asked me, how come you got converted to human rights? I think she put it slightly more politely, but you were dragging your feet. Baroness O'Neill, Honora O'Neill, talks about the fact that along with recognition of human rights comes a sense of duties. There's not much point, says Baroness O'Neill, of talking about rights unless you acknowledge whose duty it is to meet those rights. I think that's a good challenge for us from Honora O'Neill. Yes, by all means, let's emphasize human rights, but then let's acknowledge that that takes responsibilities and duties from others to meet those rights, and in Amartya Sen's language, to promote the freedoms that are embodied by those rights. So human rights do form an important part of the review. In the previous reviews that I addressed, we said a lot about threats. We said a lot about bad things happening to people. We didn't say a great deal about resilience, about the ability to respond. And I have to say that what moves me much more than the adversity that people suffer is the ability of organized groups, communities, to triumph over that adversity. That doesn't come only from individuals, although we talk about individuals, but very much social action, triumphing over adversity. And that's what we mean by empowerment. I've already talked about the life course, but we say every stage of the life course is important. The issue of intergenerational equity, I said in response to Sue Atkinson's question before lunch, that the amount of inequality in this generation affects life chances of the next generation. When a minister of health of one European country said she thought the WHO should not be doing anything on this social determinants of health caper. Health is a matter for individuals. And I looked her in the eye and said, what about the children? Don't blame the children for choosing poor parents. It wasn't their fault. So the intergenerational equity really matters, and the conditions in which children grow up, and the bad luck to be born to poor parents shouldn't be a signature of death for the rest of their lives. And that relates to intergenerational equity. I sometimes think, working with governments, when we talk about joined-up action, that stitched-up action is easier than joined-up action. But the importance here, of course, of action across all the key sectors. And you heard Alan Dyson a moment ago talking about the importance of early childhood. We who come from the health sector have to be working with those who are concerned primarily with education and other things for young children. Environment, economics, social welfare, all important. And let me just say another word about proportionate universalism. We coined this rather awkward phrase in the English Review. Classic British compromise. On the one hand, people say it makes sense to spend the money where it'll do the most good. So let's focus on the worst off. Sort of everybody understands that. But two things. One is the gradient, that in population attributable risk terms, a minority of the population's burden of ill health due to social disadvantage come from the very worst off. The social gradient means that all of us below the very top are at higher risk. And if you focus only on the very bottom, then you miss most of the inequalities that are related to being below the very top. So the gradient means don't focus only on the bottom. And secondly, there are good arguments, and what we learned from our Nordic colleagues is that universalist solutions have a whole variety of positive attributes that work better. I was looking at data from France yesterday. A universal preschool childcare system benefits people to a greater extent the lower they were in the hierarchy, the more disadvantaged. But it's a universal system. It's not targeted at the worst off. So all the problems of labeling and where you make the division between needy and not needy, the undeserving poor, all of those issues that come with targeting are avoided if you have universalist systems. However, we said, it's entirely reasonable to have effort proportionate to need. Hence the idea of proportionate universalism. And we pushed that very strongly in the European review. You've seen these 4 domains. I'll show them to you again in a few minutes. And I'd say we now want to hear from 2 of our task groups, apart from Alan, about how they put this into action.
Thank you very much indeed. And just to thank you, Michael, for setting the scene like that. Just to make up for the gap here, can I invite onto the stage a colleague of yours from UCL, Martin Bobak, Professor of Epidemiology. Are you there, Martin? Yeah, come up and take Alan Dyson's seat. Not to make a presentation, but just to... I like a tidy panel, you know, I don't like holes in it. And... just very quickly to you, Agis, while Martin's taking his seat, on the importance of early development, and we heard Alan Dyson, but I couldn't put this to him because he had to rush. I've been talking to some of the delegates at lunch, and when you look at the report, the importance of early development, I'm a mother of 4 children, so I'm very interested in this myself. Why no mention of breastfeeding at all?
I think that when we think of early development and we think of the whole of the services and the support that you need to provide to a family and to a mother from gestation to the early years of life in terms of education, social access to health services. This is an implicit and integral part of the kind of help that you need in terms of education for the mother to use breastfeeding and of course this kind of practices that make a huge difference in the child's development.
So do you mind my saying that it's not mentioned explicitly? Was that an oversight or was it deliberate?
No, it was not deliberate, and I'm sure there is always, in the longer report, I think there may be a reference already. You're all looking at the short report.
Oh, okay.
Michael is already looking and
I may stand corrected. How many women here, mothers, think that breastfeeding should have been mentioned as important as an early intervention? Yeah, quite a few. Ooh.
Of course.
So I'm not alone. All right, let's see what the long report says. Michael is busy fact-finding for us, and while he's doing that, are you? Ulla Lundberg, another perspective from Sweden. We heard from Denny this morning, and now Ulla Lundberg is Professor of Health Equity Studies. He's currently Director of Centre for Health Equity Studies in Stockholm, and his main interests have included welfare research, health inequities.
I think we should...
Oh, right, okay, sorry, just hold your thought for a minute.
Even in the executive summary, not even in the main report, and recommendation 1A, I don't think you can get any earlier than that.
All right, I stand corrected.
Increase breastfeeding.
Which page is that?
That's page 6 of the executive summary.
Okay, I stand corrected. Oh yes, of course, absolutely. Increase breastfeeding and promote skills and knowledge for effective parenting. Perhaps it should have been a bit more obvious then.
1A, more obvious than that.
I don't like to be proved wrong. Ulla Lundberg, please give us your findings, because you looked at welfare on this for us, so please do, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This latest issue shows how much evidence there is in this report, and so much that not even Michael can keep track of it all. I'm going to give you some insights of the work we did in Task Group 4, and end up with the now famous catchphrase, do something, do more, do better. Task Group 4 was actually tasked with a huge area of GDP, taxes, income, and welfare. And we narrowed it down to some extent, as I show you in short. But to make it short, I think we claim that an investment in social protection policies is likely to improve health and reduce health inequalities. And we also claim that this applies actually to all the countries across the whole European region, although in different ways. But in short, the starting point for our work is indeed welfare as command over resources. That the welfare resources necessary to lead a good life are actually also the same resources, the same factors that determines health, or the social determinants of health, if you like. There are many of these resources that are important for health, but here we focus on economic resources. Economic resources can easily be transformed into other types of resources of importance, and they are certainly linked in themselves to health through material, social, and psychological factors. So income and economic resources are at the center of the heart of social determinants of health. These economic resources comes from different places, from different sources. They are indeed generated by individuals and families through gainful work or in other ways in the family. But there are also collective resources that you can draw on when you need, that you can draw on when you're unemployed, when you're sick, when you cannot support yourself through work because of old age and a number of other cases. And these are provided through the welfare state. And these collective resources are also of two kinds. There are social insurances and income transfers, the so-called cash side of the welfare state. But there are also health and welfare services that are subsidized or free of charge at the point of use, the care side. And taken together, these collective resources are very important. The supply and quality of these collective resources are likely to influence people's ability to sustain their health and well-being. And the less people have in terms of individual resources, the more important it is that they can draw on collective resources of good quality, of good coverage, of a good kind. Some key points in the work we did, or some important starting points based on our earlier experience in the field, is that it's really important to focus on general policy areas, these big social policy schemes like unemployment insurance, sickness insurance, pensions, etc. Not only on specific interventions. It is often the case in science that we have very good evaluations of specific interventions. But when it comes to the general social policy schemes that affect all or a large proportion of the population, the traditional evaluations are not so easy to make, and hence the evidence are of a different kind. Precisely because of this, I think it's very important that we focus on these general policy areas. When doing so, it's also very important to look at what welfare states do, not just what they are called. There's a lot of research out there looking at welfare states regimes or clusters of welfare states labeled in different ways. But it's actually more important to look at the actual social rights, the legislations that puts into place what people can actually expect to get from the welfare state when they need. Or another route to look at the social expenditure, what the welfare states actually pay out, or the resources, the amount of resources used for these programs. However, very little of this crucial work is actually in place. So while we have done some reviewing work, we have also put quite a lot of effort into doing original research, because there are some very important knowledge gaps in this area. Some of the findings we get out of our work in the task group is that there is a relationship between social protection, both in terms of social rights and social expenditure, and the level of health, but more importantly here perhaps, the size of health inequalities. This relationship is often, if not always, curvilinear, which means that there are larger gains to be made at lower levels, or if you turn it around, more difficult to think out new solutions on the higher levels of social spendings. Specific programs, such as unemployment benefits, to take one example, are important. They have measurable and positive effects as far as we can tell. But it's also that the combination of different programs are even more important. The more extensive social protection at large in a range of programs appear to be very important. So it's the whole package rather than individual single programs. And I want to share two examples with you today, coming from our Norwegian colleagues. This is a paper published as a result of our review. It's looking at social spending and health across a number of European countries. It's using UCL data from 2005, so there are some 250,000 individuals responding to questionnaires around Europe, but it's also looking at the social spending in these countries that these people live in. And what you see is that the predicted probabilities of poor health measured against the level of spending. So when you go to the right, you increase the spending. And you can see that for all educational groups, increased spending is linked to better health or a reduced probability of poor health. But that this effect is actually more pronounced among the low educated. It's more pronounced among the middle educated. It is still there among the high educated. But because of this differential effect of social spending across different educational levels, we also get narrower health inequalities as a result of more social spending. And this research was done in many ways. Espen and Kjetil, who made the paper, experimented with different ways of measuring social expenditure and all different kinds of ways of looking at this, and the main result holds. It looks slightly different for women than for men, but the main message is the same. More social spending is better for health and for health inequalities. But what is this then all about? This is about better, higher benefits being good for those who are unemployed, for example. Well, it's not the whole story, actually, because the same colleagues in Norway looked at the predicted probability of being non-employed. As I said initially, gainful employment is a very powerful way of getting economic resources to families. And it actually turns out that more social spending is linked, very clearly linked, with being gainful employed. The more spending, the less non-employment, and this effect is also differential across educational groups. And it also affects those who already have a long-standing illness, the left side of the picture. So having an illness, you have greater difficulties to having a gainful employment, but the more social expenditure the country you live in has, the higher your chances are to actually be on the labor market, thereby creating gainful employment for you and your family. So this, taken together and together with a lot of the other things that we reviewed and looked at, led us to these conclusions. That in countries where you have very little social protection, some efforts will be important and contribute to better health and smaller health inequalities. It may be a small pension scheme, it may be unemployment schemes, it may be something. It seems that doing something is worthwhile. In countries who already have something, do more is a good recommendation. You can always increase the coverage, you can increase the replacement rates of the programs you have, and that will lead to better health and smaller inequalities. And yet again, among the countries who spend most, who have the most ambitious welfare states and most ambitious programs of these kinds, there is still room for increases in some cases. There are still programs in well-developed welfare states that have seen reductions and cuts in recent decades. But in particular, we suggest there is room for improvements of the programs and services that are in place. This is, again, a Norwegian picture showing a very ambitious goal, leveling out the social gradient in health. I'm not sure whether it's a realistic goal or not, and I'm not saying that social protection is the only way of achieving it, but I think social protection can be one important piece of the jigsaw puzzle to achieve at least a leveling out of the differences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ola. I'm sure we'll touch on some of those issues that you've raised there. But just now, to give us a perspective on social exclusion, we have Jenny Poppe, and she led the task group on vulnerability and exclusion for the review. She, since 2002, has been Professor of Sociology and Public Health at the Institute for Health Research at the University of Lancaster. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. Yes. Good afternoon. Yes, I'm coming to give you some of the key lessons from the Social Exclusion, Vulnerability and Disadvantage Task Group. Quite a mouthful, actually, and all the task groups covered very broad terrain, but I think this one might get the prize for being the broadest and most difficult to kind of get a grip on. So I just want to acknowledge the range of people that were involved. I won't go through the list, but there were a lot of people who contributed to the task group. And what we did to try and make it manageable was to focus in on some what we called exemplar topics. So we looked at the experience of Roma people in Europe, we looked at child poverty, we looked at irregular migration, at disability, and at inequalities in cities. And we have done a series of case studies of action to improve the circumstances of Roma people in Europe. But we were mostly social scientists for a change. I was giggling to myself when Michael said that one of the reasons he didn't get involved in health rights was because it was jobs for lawyers. He thought, well, I didn't get involved in social determinants for a while because I thought it was jobs for doctors, but I got convinced that it wasn't that as well. So, but this lot there's a lot of social scientists in here. So what we've done, I think, unusually is look at a very broad range of evidence, typically evidence that wouldn't normally be included in the public health and health domain. But we also did a lot of challenging of some of the taken for granted issues in this field. So what I want to do is just very briefly talk about a small number of lessons from a synthesis across these exemplar topic background papers that we produced. So the first one, which is sociology to its core, is this notion that the meanings we attach to words shapes the actions that we make. And so what is common across the work done by different exemplar topic groups in this task group was the idea that the dominant use of some of these key concepts risk making the fundamental causes of health inequalities, what Michael has referred to again and again as the causes of the causes, we risk making those less visible because we attach particular kinds of meanings to some of these key concepts. And in particular, of course, here it's this notion of exclusion and vulnerability, and I would argue the same goes for resilience, lots of these words. So just let me very briefly say what I mean. So here you have the typical contours of exclusion. Disabled people, around 11%, probably more in Europe, severely disadvantaged, stigmatized, very prejudiced views, unequal places. We've got growing child poverty now in this period of austerity. The Roma, Europe's most disadvantaged group perhaps, irregular migrants, all in the news in the last few weeks as the Roma. So these are typically how we think about exclusion, right? Excluded groups. These are excluded groups. They're also vulnerable groups because being excluded makes you vulnerable. Now, absolutely, these groups are severely disadvantaged groups. They are experiencing the brunt of the problems of health inequalities and its social determinants. But the problem with this approach, with this labeling of people, which I'm never quite sure who we refer to, but certainly in the public health field, we typically do, is that it's like a shopping list, right? I use this kind of metaphor of a shopping list. We keep adding to the list of groups that are excluded. We never stop, you know? And they're excluded from an increasing list of things. So it makes it very difficult. But more importantly, this approach really tends to locate the problem in the individual or in the group. And so it locates the action focused on those individuals and on those groups. And at the very least, that's stigmatizing. But actually, more profoundly, it actually means that we tend to forget or give less priority to the wider causes, the causes of the causes and actions to address those. So our task group would argue very strongly, and it's threaded through the Euro review, although we tip backwards and forwards between this idea of a state of exclusion to the alternative approach, which is to view these concepts as processes embedded in relationships, right? So the better way of doing this from a social determinants perspective is to think about social exclusion as consisting of dynamic processes which are driven by unequal power relationships. And these processes interact at a number of levels. They're economic, they're social, they're cultural, and they're political. And they can be found at different levels: the household, individual, the city, the region, the country, globally. And it's the processes that action should be seeking to reverse. But crucially, those processes are embedded in these relationships. So we have to look upstream, we have to look at the relationships to other parts of society. And these processes, the task group, if you look across the reports, what's embedded in there is the notion it's not people that are vulnerable, it's the social spaces that they are forced to inhabit that are vulnerable. And we have to change those social spaces. And the reason we talk about social spaces rather than places is because some groups carry these vulnerable social spaces around with them. So the Roma are vulnerable wherever they are. It's not located in a particular place because it's about social systems, social stigma, prejudice beliefs, etc. So this alternative focuses on processes, it focuses us on relationships, and it focuses us on spaces, not people, not characteristics of people. And it also would prioritize the idea of disadvantaged people having creative agency. They're not passive in the face of adversity. They may not act the way we want them to. They may choose not to breastfeed. But they are creative in their adversity. They're logical. The action they take is logical in the face of that adversity. And we need to recognize that logic. We need to recognize that creativity. Lesson 2, which has come up a number of times from across our background papers, was that the range of actors and agencies, a wide range of actors and agencies, have a role in reversing exclusionary processes. But national, social, and economic policies are crucial. And too often, those policies drive exclusionary processes, and those processes create vulnerable places. And I'm going to just very briefly give you one example, which is close to my heart, which some of you may have heard me before, Michael and others sure have. But one in the child poverty report by Jonathan Bradshaw, one of the points he makes is that the level of child poverty in a country is an explicit act by government. They can raise it or they can lower it, right? So it's not some hard fact. It is actually the product of policy, that it goes up or it goes down, the kind of thing that Ollie was just talking about. So government policy are actually critical here. But just let me very quickly tell you about the case of behavioral conditionality, because we do talk about welfare systems a lot, but what's kind of now gone a bit underground is this move from universalism to targeting, not proportional universalism, but targeting, and what I refer to as behavioral conditionality, right? To the poor, if you behave the way we want you to behave, we'll give you some money. And often that money is the basic amount to live on, right? And the problem with behavioral conditionality is that it is actually the antipathy of inclusion, right? It assumes that poor people are irresponsible, that if we don't bribe them, they won't behave sensibly. It's naming and shaming. It uses stigma as an informal social control. Economic coercion, cash is used to manipulate behavior. The evidence suggests that it does improve functioning, although it actually sometimes works less well for those people who are more disadvantaged than those who are least disadvantaged. But it may actually increase inequalities, and it certainly doesn't promote social cohesion. So if we are going to do behavioral conditionality, there are some kind of conditions that we suggest might make it less stigmatizing and more conducive to social cohesion. So the conditions should be readily able to be met. In some places, that is not the case. But they should also perhaps be located at the community level or the collective level rather than at the individual level. So you encourage communities to do things in order to improve the places in which they live. So the conditions could be collective conditions. The conditions could actually be prioritized by the people who you're targeting. They could choose what conditions they wanted to be imposed on them. And the whole program could be administered through more participative mechanisms. So if we do have to have behavioral conditionality, then we can make these programs more conducive to social cohesion and less stigmatizing. So the third key lesson is that empowering disadvantaged people has transformational potential. We've talked a lot about empowerment. And, you know, sometimes I'm tempted to say what's central here is actually disempowerment. Because what I'm talking about is empowering people who have least power. But to do that, every one of us will have to give up some of our power. So we could turn this on its head and say, actually, central to this is the disempowerment of professionals, of civil servants, of managers. We all need to give up some power in order to give more power to the people who we serve. What is empowerment? Very quickly, just to say, it came out of Latin America, they still talk in Latin America about this is giving people with little power real power over decisions that affect them. In England, it tends to be do it yourself. No, it's DIY, and there are many communities in England who have been really damaged by poorly practiced empowerment. So you need to think very carefully about what you mean by empowerment. Let's not use that word too casually. Think very carefully about what it means. It's often presented as a magic bullet. It isn't, and it can actually damage people when it's done badly. So the reason empowerment might lead to greater health equity is through what I refer to as experiential knowledge. In England, we have this saying, the people who wear the shoes know where they pinch. So the people who experience exclusionary processes understand those processes and their impacts. So that experiential knowledge is an enormous resource for policy and practice. The enhanced individual and collective control, there's a lot of research, some of which done by Michael and others, that shows that control can improve health, another bit of the pathway. Empowerment, done well, improves social relationships between people. It builds community cohesion, it builds social cohesion. And at the individual level, it can enhance skills. So research that I've done shows that people who get engaged in local decision-making initiatives can often build up their employability. They're more likely to get jobs, the ones for whom it works. But lesson 4 is that empowering systems need to release this capability. They need to release this capacity, and it's certainly in the countries where we've looked at it, they don't do that very often, right? And I just flash this up for you. That's why they don't do it very often, right? We did a piece of research identifying the barriers to community empowerment. I'm not going to go through it. Here's a simple model for you, right? The yellow circle, it's not quite a circle, that's where we focus all our energy, is building the community capacity to engage. Actually, the other circles are much more important. National policy imperatives that talk about empowerment and then require local programs to deliver quickly. So they break the psychological contract with local people. They don't give them time to get engaged. The public sector, bless it, we might not have it for very much longer, but while it's there, we have cultural problems in the public sector about how they engage with local people. I get really, really worried when I hear about professionalizing workers in the children's sector, because actually professionalism is part of the problem. We need to modernize, get 21st century professionalism, and think about what that means for the relationships with the people who are served. And then there's the practice of empowerment, really poor, you know, simple things like actually making sure the time is appropriate for getting people engaged, that the buildings are accessible, that, you know, you've got resources to fund people, to all of those kinds of things which are frequently ignored or underestimated. So, what we need is to develop governance structures that enable communities to steer governments. I don't like this partnership notion, actually. Partnership in practice in the front line, perhaps, but actually, the people should be in control. They should be steering, listening, and we should be listening more. We need to create new knowledge spaces where this experiential knowledge can be combined with professional expertise, with research expertise, to produce new synthetic types of knowledges, new ways of thinking about problems, new ways of creating solutions. We need to shift power relationships, and we can do that by looking very carefully at program mechanisms. So we embed mechanisms that give individuals and communities more control over how the problem is defined and how the solution should be worked out. And we need then to create new action spaces where communities are in control of what's happening to them. The risk of not doing this, of not doing genuine empowerment, of not giving up some power, are quite considerable, I think. And there is a lot of evidence that we've already got very negative consequences of this. So the argument across all of the task group's work is that lay people, you know, ordinary people, are skilled interpreters of their own experience. And they're also quite skilled at interpreting other kinds of evidence. And that's including the most disadvantaged, the people who are often seen to be in need of education. They have enormous amounts of wisdom and knowledge. The neglect of this wisdom in health inequalities policy and practice has produced evidence that is disconnected from people's lives. And there are many examples through the task group's reports. And as a result, we do have policy and practice that's focused on the wrong problem. Right? I would argue that for some groups, breastfeeding is the wrong problem at the moment. You know, it's a very low priority in their lives, and as long as it's a low priority in their lives, no amount of health promotion and health education is going to get some women to breastfeed their babies. Right? So we focus on the wrong problems, we prioritize inappropriate solutions to these wrong problems, and there is evidence that some of our interventions are widening inequalities. So the risk of business as usual in terms of giving power to disadvantaged people in order to address exclusionary processes, in order to do something about these vulnerable social spaces that they are forced to occupy. These risks are high, and I always end up with a joke just to take the emphasis of what I've been waffling on about. So here's my joke. This was on the road in Australia, Michael's home country. That's where his sense of humour comes from, I think. So, caution, this sign has sharp edges. Do not touch the edges of the sign. But most people stop there. If you look right at the bottom, it says, and the bridge up ahead is out. So the message is, you know, we need to read beneath the surface of things and be very careful about taking for granted the language we use. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny. Pressures of time, alas, mean that we don't really have any time at all to have a panel discussion, but I'd just like to share with you some of the points that we've had from our webcast viewers, some applauding it, saying this is great. Whole office is watching, Merseyside. Anyway, some of the points that were raised that we may not have time to tackle, but picking up on the importance of healthy public spaces, the role of healthy cities in addressing inequities, somebody has asked, and somebody's asked about the message to other regions from this report on Europe, and that was a comment from Nigeria. And somebody's asked if these problems could be addressed in a reasonable time, and what is a reasonable time. And then also perhaps picking up the comment that you made, Ollie, about the need for social protection and so on. Somebody's asking how you can balance doing that, the need to address inequity, social justice, resilient communities and social protection, yet at the same time taking into consideration economic situations and the constraints that brings. And we talked about early child development and the role of mothers also, and somebody's asking how we can tackle men's health also as an issue that they think is important. Martin, just very quickly to you, because I know you haven't got time. We haven't got time for you to make a presentation, but I think it was Ola who talked about the fact that you do have this patchy picture in terms of data. It isn't always there, and so it's this inequalities in evidence base, particularly in countries with high mortality. The countries that actually need the database are the ones that don't have it. So I know you've done a lot of research in this, but maybe you could just comment on that briefly.
I co-chaired a task group called Measurements and Target for Michael's Commission, and it's almost an implicit or an explicit finding of this task group that there are international inequalities in health, and in the same direction there are inequalities in evidence. So the countries where mortality is highest, and we have reasons to believe the inequalities are biggest, they have very little evidence. There are usually national data, there are occasionally subnational data, but there are often no individual level data between educational groups, occupational groups, and so on. And in fact, it's getting worse because some of the countries have now removed the socioeconomic stratifier, education or employment, from their death certificates. So we can't link death certificates with census anymore. So these countries which struggle most have the least data. And I just wonder whether there is a causal association between lack of evidence and lack of concerns about inequalities. Because if you don't know about it, you don't do anything about it.
And has there been any studies? So what you say quite clearly is the lack of both local and national evidence means, is there evidence that as a result of that there is a failure to act at both the local and national level to address the...
Well, the countries would know, at least their governments would know, that mortality rates are high. But last week I was in one of the Central Asian republics, and when I showed them Michael's graph on mortality and life expectancy, they did not know that their own country is one of the worst in the European region. So one thing is the knowledge, but when it comes to within-country inequalities, there are no data.
Mm-hmm. And Ola, just very quickly before I turn to Michael, you talked about the need for social protection as a tool to address inequities, but picking up on what Susanna Jakob was saying this morning, it isn't just the money that matters, isn't it? It's the right policies. So a country like your native Greece, Agisouros, which is obviously going through a terrible financial crisis where we know there have been very, very deep and sweeping cuts in the health budget. It isn't just the money, though. You can't just say, oh, we're going through a financial crisis, we can't get the right policies. It's actually making sure you have the right tools.
It's not just about the money. You can look for the most rich countries in the European region, like Norway. They still have health inequalities, but it's about what you do with the money, I guess. And what we can see is that social protection appears to be a social investment in social infrastructure was used earlier. And one example of that is that everyone benefits from, say, a good unemployment benefit. We can see that also the employed have better health in countries where unemployment benefits are better, which alludes to a sense of security, a better social infrastructure for all people. And that means that I think that social protection can be seen as an investment. And in hard times, you may be well off by investing for better times later on.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Michael, I invite you back to the lectern to now give us a presentation on the review's recommendations. If you could set those out for us, please.
Thank you. I considered, given the lateness of the hour, sacrificing this session, but it seemed slightly imbalanced to have the whole day and not talk about the recommendations. So I've decided to go forward. Let me just say what Martin Bobak said a moment ago, much more eloquently than I did this morning, asked what are the barriers. When you asked that, Zainab, and I said one of the barriers is ignorance. And as Martin has said, not having the evidence. Let me say something parochial. The Office for National Statistics is considering reducing the amount of data it produces on health inequalities. I think this would be a calamity because ignorance is not bliss, ignorance is terrible, and we don't want to advance the cause of ignorance. So speak up. That's a commercial over. I mentioned our 4 domains of recommendations, all of which are important. In number 1A of the life course included breastfeeding, just to remind you. But only fleeting, yeah. It only mentioned it once in the executive summary, that's true. So we start with the life course. And we talk about good quality parenting, family building, and gender equity. I showed you a slightly different graph earlier this morning. At first blush, it might have looked the same. This is looking at mortality of children younger than 5 by household deprivation. Households are classified, it's the percent of households lacking 3 or more essential items. And the greater the number of households lacking 3 or more essential items, the greater the household deprivation. And you can see, even in a rich region like the European region, the greater the deprivation, the greater the mortality of children under 5. We also see a clear relation between household deprivation and poor early child development, cognitive and linguistic development, social and emotional development, as well as physical development. So poverty really matters. Can we do anything about poverty? Well, yeah, actually we can a bit. This is a bit complicated, so let me just pull out a few of the countries from that previous slide. This shows child poverty rates before and after transfers. Look at Latvia. Child poverty is defined as less than 60% median income. Child poverty in Latvia before social transfers is about 35%. In Sweden, before social transfers, it's about 32%. After taxes and transfers, child poverty in Latvia has gone from 35 to 25%. In Sweden, it's gone from 32% to 12%. In Slovenia, not a rich country, it's even lower. Governments can decide the level of child poverty they want. It's underlining the point that Ollie made a few moments ago. In the United Kingdom, we look a bit more like Latvia than we do like Slovenia. We've decided child poverty is something we'll tolerate. In fact, our policies look likely to increase child poverty. It's obviously something we as a population want. We live in a democracy. This is what happens. But you can see it's not God-given. It's not given by the state of the economy. This is something governments have the power to do. So we've shown you the very clear relation between child poverty and poor child outcomes. And child poverty is not only related to the magnitude of income inequalities, it's related to how we decide to use the fiscal levers. We can make a difference to child poverty. We can also make a difference in other ways. Preschool, enrollment in preschool education. This shows the likelihood that students who did not attend pre-primary school scoring in the bottom quartile on reading. And for all those countries, children who did not attend preschool are more likely to be in the bottom quartile of reading. So yes, what happens in the family is vital. But the evidence shows that providing high quality preschool makes a huge difference for the rest of the school career. So when we look at PISA scores, the Program of International Student Assessment at age 15 or 16, the children who were involved in preschool a dozen years later have better scores on the PISA scores. Provision of early child services makes a difference. So it's not just about reducing poverty, but it's about the quality of services. So these services should be universal and of good quality. Early years childcare, education, and then coming through the life course, of course, work. So we look at working age. Working is better than not working. And we need to get our policies right, to get the incentives right, to make it more attractive for people to work than not work. I am not Ian Duncan Smith, in case you mistook me, but I do agree that we do need to get the incentives right to make it attractive to work. And we haven't done that very well. So working is better than not working. Work provides income, but we need to look at the quality of work. It's not just work versus non-work, it's avoiding hazards and the psychosocial environment at work. So having said work is better than non-work, look at unemployment among 15 to 24-year-olds in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States of the former Soviet Union. Greater than 50% unemployment in some countries. We know in Spain, 52% of 18 to 24-year-olds are unemployed. That photo I've been showing you, the background, a young man with a cloth cap and his hand in the air, is one of the indignados on the streets of Madrid, complaining about youth unemployment. They don't like it. It's not a lifestyle choice. It's not something people choose to do. Youth unemployment, as I've described, is a public health emergency. But the quality of work matters. Demand-control imbalance, effort-reward imbalance. Let me divert, I know we're out of time, but I said to somebody this morning, I was giving a lecture in the Ministry of Health in Cuba, and the translation was serial translation, not simultaneous translation. So it took a while for the message to get through. And I talked about effort-reward imbalance, and I described that that's putting out a lot of effort, but not getting appropriate reward. Has that ever happened to one of you? And then there was this lag time as it got translated, and then the message got through. And then slowly the noise in the room swelled. By God, they knew about effort-reward imbalance. That had happened to them. This really hit a chord. Bad for health, organizational injustice, and job insecurity, all important for ill health, and all related to the social gradient. This comes from the study of health and retirement in Europe, looking at occupational class. The lower the class, the more likely are people to be in jobs characterized by imbalance between effort and reward, and characterized by having little control. This is empowerment or disempowerment in action because of the nature of the work environment. And we can do something about that. Wider society. Ole has already covered this very well, thank you, and it formed the basis for what we said. Adequate social protection, social inclusion, and equity at older ages, and action across the whole social gradient. And Ole showed you that slide, so I won't show you again. The macro level context. Build resilience, reduce exclusion, strengthen communities. And what's happening economically impacts on the ability of communities to be strengthened, to be resilient, and indeed to exclude groups. And as Jenny says, she has educated us that exclusion is a process, not a property of individuals. And systems. Health systems are, of course, important, but as Susanna Jakob has reminded us, they need to be more oriented to prevention and to health promotion. We need to have universal access, regardless of ability to pay, but they need to be more oriented to prevention and health promotion instead. It relates to quality housing, to safe communities, universal healthcare, as I've just discussed, and safeguarding future generations. I would say that what we've tried to do with the report is to give it the best evidence base we could, but to make it practical. When a country, Malmö, a community, somebody says to us, yeah, but what do we do with this? We say, we've got practical recommendations that you can do, forgive me, including breastfeeding. We've got practical recommendations of things you can do. And we've got good examples of countries, of communities that are doing it already. And we end with what Ole taught us. Do something, do more, do better.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Michael, for that. And before we have a brief break for tea, Agis, do come on and tell us just how this review fits into Health 2020 for you at WHO.
Thank you. I just would like first to remind us that 30 years ago, when the Health for All strategy for Europe was launched, its first target was about inequalities. It was on equity. And it's 30 years ago since then. And many across Europe have really struggled with the idea of addressing seriously inequalities. So what is different now is the fact that then, very often, we were told that what we had in the Health for All strategy was more a kind of ideological position, but the evidence was not there to support it fully. Not that there was no evidence then, But today, you have heard it from the speakers, and you will read it in the review, there is overwhelming evidence. All the arguments are there. There are no excuses not to act. And sometimes we don't realize, however, how important it is to think about the values on which we base what we want to do. Earlier, Zainab asked Susanna, why is WHO standing by the right to health? I think it's not only because it is in our constitution. I think we have to underpin what we do by those precious values of the right to health, solidarity, sustainability, equity. Think of Europe today, the changing epidemiological landscape, the changing demographic landscape, the changing social landscape. How many issues that relate to the aging of the population, to migration, seriously challenged day after day our views about issues, and it's important to think about the right to health and about equity. But we make also a mistake. I feel that sometimes we tend to super-intellectualize all this evidence. We are unable to communicate it very often in a way that would be really receptive and easy to understand, especially by audiences that lie outside the health sector. And I think part of our failure to have impact is that sometimes we also forget that we are also trying to mobilize a Europe that does not speak English. And many of the issues, and I mean, you cannot even find a word of a difference between equity and inequality, empowerment, resilience, and so on. There is a need to do that. But I would like to now make the link to Health 2020. This review was commissioned to inform Health 2020. Health 2020 being a unifying policy framework with values, with principles, but above all, with policy priorities that are underpinned by evidence and show the solutions that work to address the public health challenges in Europe. And I would like to give you one example. Sometimes we think of inequalities almost as a separate chapter in a book about health. And yet, what we do in the Health 2020, where clearly inequalities and social determinants are identified as a strategic goal, we take the equity lens throughout all the areas that relate to public health. For example, can you really and seriously address non-communicable diseases, which is the epidemic in our Europe today, without thinking of social determinants? Making the link to the determinants and taking action on determinants will help you address the epidemic of chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases in Europe. So it is not something out there which is not terribly concrete. It is actually giving us the evidence to mobilize sectors outside the health sector. Even if the health sector was optimally working, it could never deliver the health of the nation that we can achieve if we do what this review is actually telling us. So, Health 2020, a goal about inequalities and determinants, a goal about governance, we will talk about it, a goal about life course, a goal about addressing non-communicable and the other public health challenges, a goal about strengthening health systems and especially public health, which has been the anemic, let's say, relative of the whole system with very little investment in prevention and health promotion. And lastly, the fourth policy priority of 2020 is about resilient communities. How do we invest in creating resilient communities along the lines that we heard, understanding what it means to talk about empowerment, about social capital, about health literacy, a great emerging area for public health, and so on. Lastly, one word of optimism also. Today, after Health 2020 was launched, but also in the last few years, think that there are already great champions in Europe. There are many countries in Europe that have taken on board the work on determinants and inequalities. And for the next 2 years already, my colleagues will tell you, there are 2/3 out of the 53 member states in Europe have asked WHO for support to work on developing national policies and national capacity to work on the determinants. So I think we have to catch the moment and the momentum today to work together to develop this kind of broader understanding of what it means and what it takes to make a difference. Thank you.
How do we get the politicians to listen? How are you getting them to listen to you?
Well, exactly. How do we get the politicians? As I said before, by spelling out the implications of this evidence in a way which is understandable of where they are coming from. If they come from education, from transport, from environment, from finance, and so on. We have to be better selling this evidence to agencies that may not define necessarily health as one of their values, and nevertheless, what they do greatly affects health.
You have to be a good salesman. And we had a question from Bristol, UK. Empowerment should sound good, but is there really evidence that doing it differently works? But I think we've addressed that question already. And OK, thank you, Agis. And before we break, just a quick word from you, Michael.
You may have seen before these pictures of children came up, the BMA crest. And if you bothered to read it carefully, which I must say I never did till I spent some time in the place, it says, with head and heart and hand. I rather like that for action on social determinants and health equity. We need our heads. The evidence really matters. We need our hearts. We need to be passionately concerned about inequity and social injustice. And we need our hands. We need the practical tools to make a difference. So thank you, BMA.
Good. Do you think you can manage to get back by 3:30? What do you think? 3:35. I'm feeling generous this afternoon. OK, see you at 3:35. Thank you.